Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 18th of May, and today we're looking at a lot of advances. I want to begin with the Bakir region because we have a lot of conflicting information about the status of that village. I then want to look at the situation developing around Pokrovsk, especially to the east of the city, where we're seeing the Russians continuing to develop their offensive initiative. I also want to discuss, of course, the Yablonivka direction, Chassar, and the Luhansk-Donetsk border, because we also have some back and forth advances over there. But let's begin by zooming in on a rather substantial Russian advance south of Udradny. You can see over here the gain amounts to 9 square kilometers of territory. That is a lot for this region because, for the most part, this part of the front line has been stagnant, not necessarily because of any particular, out of the ordinary Ukrainian defensive effort, but largely because the Russian forces have been focused elsewhere and this part of the front line largely is open. So neither side has really tried to invest any resources into taking over more advantageous positions, either north or southwards. So the line's been pretty much static over here, spanning from Dnipro and Heria, and then to the east, making it to the areas north of Rozdolnia. But the Russians, of course, have sensed an opportunity due to the Ukrainians stretching out their forces and largely focusing on clashes in Oleksivka and Bakhatir and actually engaging in counterattacks around Bakhatir. And so, whatever forces actually were located around the Udradny region have recently been redeployed a bit to the east, or perhaps are still involved in stabilization measures north of Veselaya and Fedorivka. So then the area in between naturally begins to get ignored over time. And the Russian forces don't need to invest that much in order to change the situation over here because, as I said, this area largely is just completely open. There are two trench lines that the Russians have largely infiltrated and can actually use as a horizontal route to advance deeper into the Ukrainian rear, depending on the situation. So now we have this geolocation from May 17th, and it's from the Shadow Drone Group, which is one of the main units involved with defensive activities and UAV efforts in this region. They're usually connected to the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, but not over the past few months. So in this video, they conducted 5 FPV strikes and grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers, onto a motorcycle that was advancing northwards, and onto houses. And those houses are probably around Rozdolnia, but they are acting as a linchpin for the Russian assaults because that's where all the forces organized through. And then they push from there northwards at a span of nearly 4 kilometers, pushing northwards. And as a result, the Russians have broken through both trench lines, as you can see over here, and are only, if we're going to measure it, what is this? 3.3 kilometers away from Odradnya. And we just don't have any indication of a solid obstacle in between. So the Russians just have to continue pushing along this one hedgerow, and then they arrive at the village. And the village is important because it acts as the connecting point between the Ukrainian garrison, which is notable in Komar, and then once again, pretty large Ukrainian groupings that are all around the perimeter of Bakhatir and have been fighting incessantly over the past couple of days. So Dradnia is important as a conduit, but it is currently in the process of being enveloped and being attacked. So definitely keep an eye for this part of the front line because if it continues to develop, it will eventually become a problem for the southern flank of the rest of the Vaptur River Valley with these villages like Zeleny Kut and Novoukrainka. It will also become a problem for the eastern flank of Komar, which is really not well defended, especially given the Russian infiltrations into this trench line. Now, to look at Bakhatir, this is where there definitely is ambiguity because some Ukrainian sources will claim that the Russians are largely not in control of the village, that there have been incidents wherein the Russians send in groups between 2 to 3 men to very quickly enter into certain portions of the town, including areas that are very deep into the town, in order to raise their flag and then get drones to record that footage and then post it on Telegram to serve as proof for people that are doing OSINT that they are actually in control of the village. And so, from a Ukrainian perspective, some of these sources are saying that it is more so a PR move. That's their allegation. But they claim that the Russians did this 13 times over the span of 24 hours. And so, at a certain point, when you have 13 groups of Russian soldiers, each of them between 2 to 3 men, raising up flags across different points in the village, like at a certain point, you have to just use that and deduce that the Russians actually are present in much of the village. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily full control, but you can't say it's under Ukrainian control either at that point. So the Ukrainians would sort of rebuff that by saying that they're located in basements. The Ukrainian forces Instead of getting out of those positions, they are letting the Russians roam around about in the open areas, in atop, in the backyards, through the road. But the Ukrainian forces are still operating in the basements and trying to resist. And so that's why there is still a contention about the status of the village. But based on recent geolocations with those flags being raised, including in the northwestern tip and the northern tip, as you can see over here, from the 36th Brigade. This is a unit that's been involved over here for a very long time. They're part of the 29th Combined Arms Army, and they claim to have cleared out 1,400 buildings, or houses rather. And that would sort of negate the point by the Ukrainians that they're still located in many of the basements, because this unit is claiming that they actually cleared out those basements. So I don't know which one is necessarily true. I say the truth is still probably somewhere in between, that there are still Ukrainians, especially in basements around the perimeter of the town, that have not been cleared out. But at a certain point, when you have a saturation of Russian infiltrations, it does indicate that the Ukrainians are unable to defend, and that the Russians have been able to seep in. And at that point, it becomes very difficult to push the Russians out. So Deep State claims it's not the first time that something like this happened, in that numerous times the Russians have just launched assaults with small groups for the sole purpose of raising a flag and then later withdrawn. But when we look at the situation here, it's actually more complicated than that. So the reason why the Russians were able to succeed in their recent advances over here is due to Russian UAV pilots getting closer to the front line. So instead of operating in an area like, say, Yazda, Poliana, or Maximivka, which is, locations very far away from the front line, they've recently been moved to Rozliv, which means that they are really close to the clashes. They're only about 5 kilometers away, meaning that their drones reach, don't have contact at a very fast pace. And, the people there, the operatives, are much more in tune with what's going on, basically the minutia of every single part of the fighting. So that gives them a natural advantage. And the Ukrainians, they don't have a similar situation with their forces, because it's not like they have any drone crews in Odradnia. That's not happening. Neither do they have forces in Oleksivka, because it's under assault from the east right now. And then Novoukrayinka and Zeleny Kuts are basically just these extremely small hamlets. Like, it's certainly possible that there are drone crews, albeit very small quantities of them over here, but I would assume that's more so you have rear infantry located over here that are moved into like plug holes in Oleksivka, not necessarily drone crews. So then where would the drone crew be? Maybe Dakhne, maybe Zaporizhia over here, somewhere along the Volga River. But more generally, a good organizing point for them would be Novopavlivka. And so you can see how there is a massive mismatch when it comes to the location of the Russian and Ukrainian UAV crews. And the Ukrainians, due to recent Russian advances, have been unable to, remain seated in the same locations. So they've been moved further westwards as a result, which further exacerbates the feedback loop. And then they're unable to respond to Russian assaults in the future at a faster pace, allowing the Russians to thereby capture additional territory. So that's some of the rationalization behind the recent Russian advances. And besides that fact, the Deep State does claim that the Russians advanced south of Bakir and took over this location over here, these open fields along this highway, and also took over much of this trench fortress. So, based on the geolocations and the Ukrainian claims, we could say the Russians are at least present in these 5.2 square kilometers, but we'll get a more crystal clear understanding of to what extent they've fully cleared out these houses over the coming days. Because we do know that on May 16th, the 33rd Brigade, we actually talked about this in the previous video, conducted a counterattack wherein they claimed to have taken back 95% of Bakir. And they also released footage of them ripping a Russian flag, stepping on it with 2 Ukrainian soldiers in camouflage. Additionally, the Russians released footage of some Ukrainian soldiers in camouflage being killed later on. So it appears that perhaps this video was not released today or yesterday, but the activities by the 33rd Brigade, including the flag removal, occurred around the 15th of May. So it could be that the timeline is a bit different, in that some of these Ukrainian localized counterattacks are actually 2 to 3 days old, whereas the videos that came out today showing a compilation of Russian infantry raising up flags could be more recent. So all of that has to be kept in mind, and that's why I've made the decision to mark those areas in yellow. Moving on, I want to look at Pokrovsk, because we do have an interesting advance. So the Chenska, we all are aware of the fact that the Ukrainians had this really deep salient into the village, which prevented the Russians from fully taking control over it, and thereby relieved pressure on the western flank of Lysivka. But now the situation has changed. We have a video from the Hornets of Dovbush, which is the FPV unit of the 68th Jaeger Brigade. They conducted strikes onto houses in northern Dochensk, thereby showing that the Russians advanced 1 square kilometer and also pushed 1 kilometer northwards, meaning that now all the focus will be on Lysivka. Again, the back and forth on Lysivka has been ruthless and unending. But now, for the first time in a while, the Russians actually have an opportunity to conduct a two-pronged attack, because for the most part, the Russians are attacking through this direction, which is extremely predictable for the Ukrainians by now. So perhaps there will be a change in momentum if that's accompanied by an attack coming from the west. So we'll have to see. But for the time being, Lysivka does hold. More interestingly, over here to the east of Munirhad, the Russians continue with their rather deep advances, this time capturing 9.3 square kilometers of territory. That is a significant quantity of land to take over within a single round of operations. At most, the armored assaults conducted by the Russians were able to push nearly 3 kilometers northwards from positions around Malinivka, meaning that now the Russians are really establishing this deep beachhead, bridgehead, whatever you call it, north of the T0504 highway. And this is all running along key heights. All this area that I've talked about extensively in earlier videos that I'm marking with this red perimeter, these areas are all located in high elevation that just give amazing vantage points to at least be on parity with the Ukrainian positions in Pokrovsk and Munirhad. And likewise, they overlook to a substantial degree the Ukrainian lines of defense that were built to the east of Munirhad, that run along the Terets River Valley, areas where you have trenches, and a lot of them were built recently in lieu of Russians approaching throughout the summer of 2024. So some of them may be a bit hastily built, especially on some of the, say, outer layers that were built. You could see that I have a red line to sort of show that over here right now. But whenever the Ukrainians are afforded the time and space, their recent buildings, recent excavations have actually mirrored a lot of the Surovikin line's characteristics. They include layers of anti-tank ditches, or not anti-tank ditches, they do, but first, dragon's teeth. And sometimes dragon's teeth have these metal rods that are connecting them. Sometimes there's barbed wire in between 3 layers of dragon's teeth. Then there usually is an anti-tank ditch, and perhaps behind that there are trenches for actual infantry. So those are some of the best Ukrainian trenches whenever they have the ability to build them up. But obviously, doing so is not really feasible near the line of contact. So a lot of those are from areas that are farther away. I would presume near the border with Dnipro further north, or perhaps around Kramatorsk and Slovyansk and Dobropilia. But that's another conversation. For now, the Russians are continuing to advance, and this time southeast of Shevchenko Pershe. You can see the video is from May 17th, and there are 2 Russian vehicles that advanced past some agricultural buildings. There are a couple of these facilities over here, and they aren't really suitable for defensive activities. They're just sort of relics that are nearby during the drone footage that you see of Russian assaults. And so, for the most part, these areas are open, meaning that they are exposed to these sort of deep Russian attacks using armored vehicles before a Ukrainian drone crew could respond and target those vehicles. And by the time they do, a lot of infantry just dismount and get seeped into the local hedgerows and dugouts. So now you have, in parallel to this, the Russians advancing into Novopoltavka. And some Russian sources claim that it was fully taken over, but I haven't seen proof of that. We do have a video from the 57th Motor Rifle Regiment, which has been deployed to this area, of their advances over here. So this is from May 17th. First, the video begins with really deep, really significant Russian strikes onto northern Novopoltavka, so high explosive radius yield. And then the Russian flag is raised near a memorial in the center of the village. But we don't have information about the northernmost chunk or the western section of Novopoltavka, so keep an eye for that. But certainly having this town under control would serve as a base of operations, because it is a bit disattached from the rest of the villages captured by the Russians in recent days, and would also give them the necessary standing to advance along this line of ravines, gullies. Also, you have this paved road over here, this vertical road that advances northwards, crosses past a Ukrainian trench line, arrives at populated areas like Poppy VR and Potavka. But this isn't necessarily the main theater of Russian operations, at least that we know of. I believe that the Russian movements over here are much more related to eventually looping around towards Pokrovsk and Munirhad to put pressure onto the northern supply line with Dobropilia. And so for now, the Russians are building a base over here, but I do believe they'll try to push westwards in the near future. And that would include overrunning these two lines and overrunning Shevchenko, Perche. So keep an eye out for that. Some of these areas that are located within this largely open hinterlands are also on similarly high elevation and remain under Ukrainian control. So there are certainly goals for the Russian forces located over here. I want to also show you guys that Bars 14, this Russian volunteer battalion that was previously operating around Zaporozhye and then also on the Luhansk front, is currently deployed to here based on videos of their forces destroying Ukrainian vehicles nearby. We also know of additional Ukrainian troop deployments to this region. So, for instance, the 36th Marine Brigade, previously there was a lot of information about their presence in Kursk and then Sumy, but they've been rotated back to this part of the front line around Donetsk, but specifically north or south of Yablunivka, where they've never been before. But I'm saying they generally have been stationed a couple of times in the Donetsk region. Now they're going to be involved with stabilization measures. That's the hope, at least from a Ukrainian perspective. So we have this video over here from May 17th from the 36th Brigade of high-yield FPV strikes onto houses in northern Novo-Olenivka, indicating a deeper Russian advance by the 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment. They are located somewhere over here, I believe. I just hope I can find them in time. But they are located in this region and have been at the cutting edge of a lot of these recent assaults. And this implies that the Russians, if we're going to measure it, are only 1.5 kilometers away from reaching Yablunivka. They also advanced north of Alexanderpil. We actually have visual proof now of the capture of Alexanderpil following several days of reporting by both the Russian and Ukrainian side of its capture. And based on this, we know that the Russians north of the village advanced nearly 4 square kilometers. So the attacks over here are being repelled, or not necessarily repelled, but being resisted by the Corsair Strike Battalion of the 91st Anti-Tank Battalion. And I think that's a mistake. It might be a strike company, not a strike battalion, but it is an anti-tank battalion. And they've been involved in fighting just to the east of Dnipro on the Dnipro border, but they were since redeployed to engage in the fighting to prevent deeper Russian advances into Yablunivka. And so they observed Russian vehicles advancing near Stara Mykolaievka recently, so they're active around here as well. Now, moving on, I want to look at Chassar because there is a slight Russian advance. Once again, pushes that are already past the citadel of the city. So you could see that based on this geolocation from May 17th, one MTLB was destroyed, and the Ukrainian channels are claiming that 13 Russians were killed in an assault that was recorded by the 24th Mechanized Brigade. The assault would indicate an advance amounting to 300 meters. So on the grand scheme of things, it's not that much, but it is important because it now indicates that the Russians were able to move vehicles past the city of Chassar and are only at a distance of 600 meters from Shevchenko, the suburb that is located southwest of the town. And naturally, that will become one of Russia's next targets because you do have this outstretched salient. I'm marking it with the red perimeter that still needs to be cleared out by the Russian side in order to then shift their focus away from Chassar, which, by the way, is located on some of the highest ground in this area that overlooks Konstantinivka externally. And from there, they can cut off areas like Shevchenko, Mykolaievka. There are a couple of other isolated districts over here that I'm sort of Xing out to show you guys that they will become eventual Russian targets. And then from there, there is this trench line that runs a bit to the northeast of Konstantinivka. There's a trench line around the perimeter of the city. But in terms of populated areas, there are not that many. It's largely just open areas in the ether that are largely also on high elevation that overlook the Terets River Valley in this particular area. So definitely something to keep in mind. Let's move on to the situation in on the border, I would say, between Donetsk and Luhansk. So first of all, the Ukrainians from the 63rd Mechanized Brigade were able to conduct two counterattacks and reclaim some of the lost territory from our previous video. So you can see over here, they retook 0.7 square kilometers of territory. We had the video of the Russian flag raised in Torska on May 15th, but since then, the Ukrainians raised their flag once again in this local church, so they pushed out the Russians. And then they also crossed over the Zharbets River and were able to basically bypass this paved road over here. And you can see this video from May 16th of the 63rd Brigade. They re-entered northern Torska and captured 5 POWs from the Russian side during that engagement. And that's indicating that the Russians did stretch out a bit too far during their initial advances over here. And naturally, the Ukrainians, who are very familiar with this part of the front line, they have a very tight-knit defensive organization and a large organizing post in Zarichny. they were able to conduct this counterattack on a small scale level and reclaim some of the territory. Over here, it's about 1.2 square kilometers captured. And now to move on northwards, you can see this advance that occurred on two prongs, I would say, but together it amounts to 8 square kilometers of territory. So it is substantial. The Russians were able to advance at most, if we're measuring it, nearly 3 kilometers northwards in the direction of Kharkivka and also just to the north of Novomikhailivka, which is still contested, by the way. So we have this one video that is from May 18th of the Mara unit of the 66th Mechanized Brigade, and they conducted FPV strikes onto dugouts and houses south of Kharkivka. Houses, I believe, that would imply that Makivka was hit during the course of the battle because Makivka serves as the conduit and the crossing point for the Russian soldiers that are involved in fighting over here. So now the Russians are shaping the battlefield in such a way that would allow them to eventually push through these gullies and then enter the Kharkivka, which is small in surface area but is difficult to overrun because, first of all, the Ukrainians do have a lot of experienced units deployed to this area. They also have a lot of drone crews that are picking off soldiers that are walking out in the open or adjacent to tree lines. So that's definitely slowing down the pace of advance. But also the geography here is generally rugged. You don't really see armored assaults here. It's largely just people advancing on foot. And then you had this other prong a bit to the west on the border between Luhansk and Donetsk. And this is again from the Mara unit. It's from the same compilation video, I believe. And it's just a strike onto a trench. There are a lot of trenches over here that aren't really mapped out, but they are notable. They're not to the same degree of anything that we really see around the Donbass region further south that we talked about around Pokrovsk, for instance. But they still are dug into the ground and are used as a hiding spot by either side. And so the Russians were able to take some of them over and were then spotted and struck by the Ukrainians in tandem. So that gives us an indication of a deeper Russian advance. What I'm looking at in the near future from this region is an entrance to the Kharkivka to see if they're able to do that and then get control over this horizontal paved road, which then leads to this vertical paved road. And this one is really important because it has access to a whole host, a litany of villages that run along the area just west of the Kharkiv-Luhansk border. And a lot of these villages, they are located in what appears to be a salient shape. The salient is not in imminent danger of being closed or enveloped. It's not anything like that. But you can already see the course of what's going on over here with the pushes coming from the south and then also with activity around Kopanki everlasting and the Ukrainians unable to counterattack over there. So I believe that even though the Russians do not really exhibit any, want, any movements that indicate that they're trying to initiate offensive activities over here, the sort of inevitable grind will eventually result in a situation where the Ukrainians that remain in numerous villages over here will be in a more compromised position. Their logistics will be targeted more and will be sort of tightened over time and then eventually squeezed out. I believe that's how the Russians will go about clearing out these villages. But it will obviously take a lot of time because the Russians are not investing as many resources into the attacks over here. Also, I want to just finish off the video by saying that Ukrainian sources report on the Russian drone, the Molnia drone, being deployed to the Donetsk region and flying at for a really deep distance into the Ukrainian rear, targeting the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk highway. You can see that highway over here. I'm marking it in red. So they're claiming that vehicles are already being struck, and they talk about a distance of 40 kilometers from the front line, which isn't necessarily true. There are some points between the line of contact, for instance, around Chassar to the highway that are actually around 40 kilometers away, as you can see. But then to put it in perspective, you can see that just northeast of the Rapilia, the distance to that span of the road from the Russian sort of salient that is sort of bolting out near Yablonivka is only about 28 kilometers. Still, it is a substantial Russian advance in terms of the distance of their drone technology because then again, the Russians aren't launching these drones from ground zero. It's a couple of kilometers back. So you're looking at 35 kilometers perhaps of range, at least in certain cases, if we're looking at 40 kilometers, and then it could be even more. And that's already beginning to cause issues for the logistics that are running along this highway. Not anything that's existential, I would say, but it is important to know as we move forward. So that's all for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.